You can mute everyone.
I am recording. Okay, I have no idea how to mute everyone.
I can, so you go to the bottom and you see where participants is.
Yeah.
Okay, click on participants.
And then just go down the line and, oh, mute all. Okay, I see.
Yep.
Current user. All right, I am, I guess, the one who's now talking. Can everybody hear me? If you just like do a thumbs up if you can hear me. Hooray, everything is great. All right, cool. Thanks for joining, everybody. It's really lovely seeing everybody's faces. So I'm just gonna be telling like random stories. As Melody had asked, it'd be nice to have my horrible stories transmitted through the internet. So yeah, thanks Melody for suggesting it, and thanks all y'all for coming together. So the stories I'm going to tell are just real short ones that couldn't make the book because usually there's not enough info on them. These are just ones that I posted online. So yeah, and I've actually got like background stuff, so I'm going to swap around as I do it. So yeah. The first one is the shortest of them, and I just like how this one ends. It's about a woman named Rani Sakhubai. It's a little hard to tell exactly when this is. I think it's like late 1700s. It's in India, specifically in Jhansi, and it takes place around this area. It's got this lake, which will become more important as time goes on. Rani Sakhubai was this kind of villainous queen who really wanted to seize control, and her son was the guy who was running things, a guy named Ramchandara. So she tried a lot of different things. She tried poisoning him secretly, and it didn't work. She tried getting assassins to go after him, didn't work. And so eventually, she was so fed up with it that she realized, okay, well, my son is always going out for these swims in this lake, as you can see. So she ended up having a bunch of spears put in the lake to try and kill her son. She's not exactly Mother of the Year in this regard. So she has these spears, and her servant actually lets the son know. Son is like, hey mom, that's not cool. Also, you've been trying to kill me all these other times. Also not cool. Could you please just go to jail? So imprisons her, but she is so overcome with anxiety over her fallen station that she ends up taking her life in the most metal way that I've heard of. She ends up swallowing diamonds until she dies, which I think is just baller. I've never heard of anybody else choking on themselves to death on diamonds. Sadly, there's really not much more information to get about her out there. In fact, if you look up pretty much anything on her, you're going to run into a lot of stuff on someone else I've covered from the same area. There's a woman named Rani Lakshmibai, who kind of famously, from the same region, several years later in like 1819, something like that, led this massive rebellion against the British with a baby strapped to her back. You can actually see there is that the baby strapped to her back and a sign saying she jumped with a horse off of this area. So one of my favorite weird ways that people have died, but didn't ever quite make it into any of my books. The second one I have for you is one that I'm amazed anybody ever actually like dug this one up. This one was from 1815. It's a person named William Brown. This is all the information, virtually all the information that is available about this human being. It's really, really hard to read, even if you have it at a full screen. But basically, British Royal Navy, there's a black woman who served as a seaman in the Royal Navy for upwards of 11 or 12 years. You can see with this in the bottom corner, if you zoom it in, you'll see that the reason that she was dismissed was discovery of being female. Basically, it came out later. They went out and interviewed her, and this is also really hard to read. She was and this is again like 1810s, so this is going to be really kind of racist shit. They call her a female African who had served as a seaman in the Royal Navy for upwards of 11 years, several of which as the captain. 5'4" strong. Features are rather handsome for a black. around 26 years of age. Her share of prize money is said to be considerable. They talk about how she has a lot of beers with her other mates. My favorite quote from the whole thing, she says she is a married woman and went to sea in consequence of a quarrel with her husband, who, it is said, has entered a caveat against her receiving her prize money. She declares her intention of again entering the service as a volunteer. So basically, she's a person who just got on a ship at a certain point. They think it was in Grenada is what they have it written down as, and then served for 12 years because she just didn't want to be around her husband, got a ton of money, and then when her husband found out, he sued to have her wages garnished so that he could have some of it, which is a classic story. There's no real historical record of what happened to her after 1816. However, there's a whole lot of, if you look up other people who have gone through similar things, there is a surprising number of people who cross-dressed and then spent a lot of time in the Royal Navy. There was actually one, Mary Lacey, who's the first known female shipwright, who ended up having not only like serving in the Royal Navy for, I think, about a dozen years, but then when she was outed, ended up getting her own pension and under her own name. She tried suing for the name that she was sailing under, but Mary Lacey didn't have any success with that, outed herself, and then was just like, give me my pension. They're like, oh, okay, I guess, which is the first and only, to my knowledge, instance of that happening. And this is again in the 1800s. Fascinating people. But my favorite one that I want to share with you today is about it's from 1922. It's a woman named Vernita Smith, also known as the Holy Terror Tomboy, who is a horse thief. She's a 16-year-old horse thief. This came out of a Twitter thread that popped up like a year or two ago from a woman named Katie Henry, KT_NRE on Twitter found it. Her story's amazing. She basically commits grand theft horse. An oil operator leaves his buggy alone and comes back and there's no horse. And then she runs off on this fucking horse. And then she gets imprisoned, but uses an iron bar to bend the bars, gets out of jail, busts out of jail, runs into the warden's quarters and slips out the side doors, steals another horse and then runs off. They chase her in a car and she literally yells, "Go to hell," and then disappears in an alleyway and into the mountainside and just gone for a while. The stories I'm posting up for you, like, they take place over the course of like 2 years. She just kept popping up in the press. So after she disappears into the mountains, they find her again. She ends up tearing the padding out of her cell, punching a hole in the ceiling big enough for her to escape out of, and then at which point they decide that they need to have a special guard for her. She demands a cigar to smoke, but they won't give her one because they're afraid she's going to set the jail on fire. So instead, they just give her a stogie to chew because they're rightfully afraid that she's going to burn the place down. As an aside, it's a really weird look back at this time in US history. If you go back and read these newspaper articles, it took me a minute to realize that when they were talking about industrial schools, that's what they were calling a jail, which I think is kind of fucked up. Anyway, so they toss her back in jail, and church people show up and try to reform her. But she says, and this is a literal quote from the newspapers, "The devil put me in here and he will get me out." I love her. She'd been committed to reform schools twice already, and she had escaped each time to hobo her way home. She basically would hitchhike her way home. And then they toss her back in, and she's just like this inveterate jailbreaker, be it actual jail or these schools, whatever. She claimed to possess supernatural powers. So like these nice Christian folk would come in and try and reform her. And basically she would put these little bags of air together and then to like gesture at them and make like sounds like she was being possessed, and like the bags would kind of float, they say in the newspaper articles, which would freak out all the ladies, and then they would run away and say that she was possessed by the devil, a fact that she was more than happy to run with. Before I'll share with you one of my favorite passages from one of the stories about her. And again, there's many newspaper articles about this gal. Before she ran afoul of the law, she took great pleasure in stirring up this dignified old city by donning brilliant riding garb at the cowboy style and galloping about the streets, whooping it up, a pistol stuck in the top of each riding boot, or flourished in the air in her hand. So she was literally like running around like with guns going pew, 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 pew. She's 16 years old. This is like Parkersburg, West Virginia. This is a small, small town in West Virginia. So she's tossed into jail again. I think this is time number 2. She then escapes again by taking out a thin blade of steel from the sole of her shoe, fashioning it into a saw, and severing the window bars in her cell. But her cell is on the 3rd floor. So what's a girl to do? This is literally like, this is straight out of a movie. She takes all the sheets and ties them together and has them down as a rope out of the window and starts lowering herself down. Problem is, they only go so far. So she has a 12-foot drop. She just jumps it because she's 16 and fuck you, you're not gonna keep me. She goes home, grabs another horse, rides off, and then like there's bystanders who start calling her the second coming of Paul Revere as she like runs out. She ends up taking a violin, which the newspapers add she plays brilliantly, although it is said she has never taken a lesson. Vernita Smith, 16 years old, everybody's favorite human being. They actually, this is the thing, the second time she's busted out at this point, 3rd time, they give up on finding her. The sheriff literally goes on record as saying, there ain't no jail that'll hold her, and just let her go. So that goes for like another, like, we don't see her again in the newspaper articles for another year, at which point she's in jail again, captured, and they find a saw and file in her shoes and catch her with her cellmate trying to bust out again. This time she's foiled, and apparently she stays in for upwards of a year. And that's basically the last of the newspaper articles about her. Like a bunch of people, including me, once they found out about her, were like, we need to know everything, and like went on like a microfiche tear. We were just trying to find every single record of Vernita Smith that could be out there, but there just wasn't any. But this started out of a Twitter post. Again, this woman, Katie Henry, went out and found all of these different newspaper articles, right? So she posts about them and it goes viral. And it turns out that one of the people who reads it ends up coming across it, knew Vernita Smith, and finds out that her name wasn't actually Vernita Smith, it was Vernita Smith. And the newspapers got it wrong. And so they were able to find all this extra info out. And basically had been the next door neighbor to this woman. They sort of reconstruct what had happened afterwards. She married a dude, had a boy and a girl, outlived her husband and her daughter, and lived until 82, died of a car accident. Would always tell these wild, crazy stories, but never really much about her teen years. It's thought she kind of had a tough life. But the thread ended with like this great story about how this woman who knew her, she would like be a neighbor, like come into her the woman's husband's I think at a car, sold cars or something. Vernita Smith would come in and tell these stories, and then at one point she mentioned winning a ribbons for fiddle. At which point she took out a violin and blew them all away. So she was, in fact, as they had said in all the old articles, a prodigy at the violin. Teenage horse thief made good. Love her to death. West Virginia, she's too good for you. So yeah, those are the stories that I love, that I'm never able to really like put in any book because they're not quite long enough. But I will add one story. Then this is straight up. I'm just going to read the thing that I wrote. This is a Egyptian fairy tale that is how to put it. It's another one of these like snow or Cinderella type tales. Like pretty much everywhere has one of these stories. It's the story of Juleidah. This is one that has never made it into any of my books. I'm just going to straight up read this because I think it's funny. So here we go. Neither here nor elsewhere, begins this Egyptian folktale, lived a king. This nameless king, it said, loved his wife and his daughter above all things. And so when his wife died of unspecified causes, let's say spontaneous combustion, he was so distraught that he would only consider a woman so similar to his wife that she could comfortably wear his late wife's anklet. Bit of a footman, the king. The king's matchmaker soon informed him that the only woman in his entire kingdom who fit the glass slipper, anklet, was, you guessed it, his daughter, the princess. The king, being a man of traditional family values, saw no problem with the matchmaker's suggestion of incest and set about arranging their wedding. Continuing his foray into aristocratic stereotypes, the king also neglected to tell his daughter of her impending nuptials. In fact, the princess only learned of the imminent grossness after bribing a servant for the identity of the mystery bride she'd heard her father was to wed. Upon hearing it was her, the princess noped right the F out of there. Vaulting over the castle walls from her elevated terrace, the princess landed in a leather tanner's yard. Shoving a fistful of coins into his hand, she pleaded for him to fashion a head-to-heels disguise as quickly as possible. The tanner threw his entire being into the task, focusing every bit of ingenuity and skill into it. After a night of tireless effort, he proudly presented the princess with his magnum opus, an appallingly hideous patchwork quilt of leather scraps, showcasing the sort of virtuoso craftsmanship you would expect of a drunk third grader. The tanner was not very good at his job. Reasoning it her only hope of escape, the princess donned this masterpiece of hobo couture and headed to the city gates. Along the way, she was stopped occasionally by guards, who were by now searching for the missing princess, and always offered just this reply. My name is Juleidah, for my coat of skins. My eyes are weak, my sight is dim. My ears are deaf, I cannot hear. I care for no one far or near. And it worked. The guards let her pass and she escaped the city, fleeing on foot to a neighboring country. And in short order, word of her arrival spread through this new land, with many talking of her as a monstrous, shambling mound likely to be an ifrit. The queen of this land, cementing her reputation for wise rule and measured decision-making, demanded this apparently supernatural creature be brought into the palace so she could gawk at it, I guess. The queen's terrified servants carried through on this ludicrous demand. The queen asked the filthy pile of refuse before her to identify itself. The princess underneath again replied with her 4-line poem informing the queen of her many disabilities. No, nobody caught on to the fact that the ostensibly deaf creature had replied to a spoken question. The queen, delighted at the terrifying novelty she'd invited into her life, asked Juleidah what skills she possessed that the queen may put her to work around the palace. Anything you ask me to do, I am ready to try, Juleidah replied, again proving that she was terrible at pretending to be deaf. Luckily, the queen ignored this glaring incongruity, for she had just hit upon the perfect idea, to put Juleidah to work in the kitchen. Because really, what better place to install a blind and deaf stranger, one that is quite possibly a literal devil, than preparing everyone's food. After Juleidah had been employed for some time, the queen held a small soiree to which she invited the palace staff. Juleidah initially stayed put, falling back on her I'm a disabled misanthrope poem, but as soon as everybody had left, she shucked her loathsome tatters and joined the party in her finest regalia. Everyone was dumbstruck. Who was this elegant and lovely woman? But as soon as she'd caught everyone's attention, Juleidah tossed some of her gold sequins to the floor, causing a stampede of money seekers, and in the confusion, she escaped undetected, slipping back into her pungent leather duds. Early the next morning, the queen barged into her son's room, babbling excitedly about the mystery woman she'd met the night before. The queen continually voiced her regret that she'd just barely not had time to marry her beloved son and sole heir, the prince, off to this random woman that she'd met at a party. The prince, intrigued by the tales of this alluring party crasher, resolved to make her his bride. And so, the next night, the queen threw another gathering and the same thing happened. Juleidah slipped into the party once it was in full force and refused to answer everyone's questions the entire night. At daybreak, she threw some pearls to the ground like a greed-based smoke bomb and made her escape. As she fled, the prince grabbed at her, and in the scuffle, his ring came off in her hand. Before she disappeared, he yelled, "At least tell me where you came from," to which she replied, "I live in the land of paddles and ladles," and vanished. The next day, the prince resolved to head on a journey to this paddle-ladle land of which he'd recently heard so much. He set the kitchen to making food for his journey, and sure enough, blind, deaf, possibly demonic Juleidah was part of the team effort. The disgustingly misshapen cake that resulted from her efforts caught the prince's eye as soon as he set out on this epic journey. Informed that the seemingly insane supernatural creature his mother kept as a pet had made it for him, he of course ate it first. To his surprise, the first bite contained something slightly more inedible than the rest of the pastry, his lost ring. Realizing Juleidah's true identity, he turned his caravan around, probably for the best, as he evidently had no idea where he was going to begin with. I mean, seriously, land of paddles and ladles, where did you think you were going, doofus? The two were married shortly after his return, after he tricked her into coming near him and cut the leather robe into bits with a knife. They lived in bliss for a bit until the day that Juleidah's incest-happy dad, remember him, came looking for his daughter along with the matchmaker. Instructing her new husband to invite her father in for coffee, Jewelada donned the prince's robes and, properly disguised, joined her father and the matchmaker. Throughout the coffee date, Jewelada kept twisting the conversation to incredibly socially awkward tales of a princess fleeing her incestuous father, ignoring the matchmaker's attempts to move the conversation towards something not quite so creepy. Jewelada finally relayed her entire story from the time she'd left the palace until that very moment, at which point she shed her disguise and revealed herself. Blithely ignoring her father's role in the string of extremely bad decision-making that had instigated her exile, she shouted, "It is I, your daughter, whose life was ruined by the crappy advice this old matchmaker lady gave you." And in the morning, they threw the matchmaker lady off the cliff. The king gave half his fortune to his daughter and her husband, and they all lived happily ever after, except for the matchmaker lady. Poor matchmaker lady, you deserve better. You were just thinking outside the box. The end. So those are the stories I have for you today. I would like to do this some more and maybe have more stories, maybe on a weekly basis. I don't know, but yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I'm gonna unmute people now and stop recording. So here we go.
Yay, unmuted.
Yay, thank you.
Yay.
Yay.